Management and leadership is the first topic. I normally give this class in the first day, but we're doing it a little different this time, trying to make some time for us to be able to get ready for both classes that we do on the first day, since we're splitting it for physical distancing. But management and leadership is what we're going to be talking about today. There are currently 5 domains of practice relevant to being a long-term care administrator. Management and leadership is but one of those domains, and the one we're going to start to pull back the veil on and start to look at what it means. I've been organizing Administrators University since late 2009, and in my role as the director for OSBELCA, I've seen hundreds of reports, referrals, and complaints, and I can tell you that your leadership and management skills are probably the most important skills for an administrator to have. I frequently say that leadership matters. Leadership does matter, and so far I've never found anyone who doesn't agree with that statement. Without leadership, we are all aware that almost any system would devolve into one dominated by chaos. There's no direction and so forth. Typically, I would pause my presentation at this point and have you watch this short video. The URL is on the screen for you, and since I'm teaching this to you virtually, I need to depend on you to either pause this presentation, go to that URL, and come back to this presentation. Or maybe you've watched it prior. We'll see whichever one. If you've watched it prior, just sit here and wait for a second and we'll go on. What you just watched was a video with a couple of Navy SEALs telling you some things about leadership. I trust you will take away some things from their words, but I want to point out the part about finger pointing, because I see that all too often when someone is reported to the board. They tell us that someone else didn't do their job, or that the owners up the chain didn't allow them to do something or force them to do something that they would not have advised. My point here is that you need to take all of this to heart and make sure your subordinates understand the roles and that their roles, and that you should also hold yourself accountable and responsible to make sure that you're also properly influencing the decisions made above your pay grade. There is a difference between leadership and management. Too often, I've attended CEU seminars myself where I've heard a speaker introduce themselves and state things like they work at a certain place and manage 250 people and led the facility through some ordeal such as this recent pandemic. I'd like you to stop for just a second and consider what is wrong with either of those statements. Managing 250 people or leading a facility through something. Ponder the question of the difference between leadership and management. Or is there a difference? I absolutely believe there is a difference. But pause the video a second if you want and see how you would answer that question. To you, what is the difference? To me, the difference is relatively clearly stated. You lead people and you manage things. So, someone telling me that they led or managed 250 people not only does not impress me, it disturbs me that someone has risen to that level and does not yet know the difference between leading and managing. And I don't think that leadership or management is more important than the other. One is not more important than the other. I believe they're both important. And NAB does too, apparently, since it is one of the domains of practice identified, but I do think you need to know which one you're doing, because one is really an art and the other is more of a science. Leadership is really the art, where management is the science. You do need to know which one you're doing, and the day you start trying to manage people, and stop and think about that, think how much you detest being micromanaged. You know that you're making a huge mistake. Lead people and manage things. If you learn nothing else from this presentation, I hope you learn that this is the difference between leadership and management. I provide this slide for you to consider pretty much on your own. There's not a lot I can say about this in a video, but if you happen to have a question about it, I'd be happy to discuss it with you. It does speak quite well for itself if you'll take a moment, consider it, and what it says about your style. You need to understand your style. There is a time and a place to be a leader. There's a time and a place to be the boss. Knowing when to wear those different hats, knowing when those times are important is for you to be able to act appropriately. And didn't I say that leadership is an art? Here's another slide that I really don't have a lot to say about, except again, that it's something I think you should consider and understand. It's not saying that having a personality isn't helpful or that being aggressive is wrong. Because since it's an art, there is a time when any of those things might be helpful in a certain situation. It says you've got to have the right situations. To a degree, if you only know how to lead one way, sure, that's going to work in a certain situation, but it won't be so ideal in another. A sculpture and a painting are both art, but you don't hang a sculpture on a wall, typically, or mount a painting in the park for the birds to land on. That brings us to another video that I want you to watch. This is I want you to pause the presentation if you haven't already watched this, and take yourself to this URL and watch this video. It's a TED Talk given by Simon Sinek, and explains rather well how leaders inspire action. It's one of the most beneficial videos that I will show you. Now that you've watched it, I would tell you that he has a book out there, and it's called Start With Why, obviously. And I would like you to consider that you, having my assumption being that you did watch the video, I want to remind you here that we're still talking about leadership, and that means we're talking about people. So I think it's worth your consideration of adding that fourth circle, which I think he just assumed that everybody would understand, his why, how, and what, to pull it all together to include who we're talking about. When we start talking about people, we also realize that people work within different cultures, different circles of culture. The culture in a classroom is usually pretty interesting for us to observe, as we typically don't have assigned seats. But for example, we observe that our students usually sit in the same seats on the second day of class as they did on the first. Since half of the class is sitting here in one day and another half the other day, and we bring half of them in different halves, it might be interesting to watch people fighting over the seats the second day of class. So we're going to be watching that, and it might be interesting to see. But talking about culture, culture is something we need to consider when we take on the mantle of leadership. Simon Sinek just shared the why factor, which represents what we believe and value, and our behaviors spring from those values and beliefs. If you were to travel around Oklahoma, you would see that there are different cultures in different parts of the state. The residents, as well as employees, have different values and beliefs in different places and do things differently in the northeast part of the state than they do in the southwest, for example. What works in Tulsa is likely not going to be so successful in Altus. The formation of Oklahoma led to these different cultures in and around Oklahoma, but they are distinct and real. Organizations also have different cultures. Not-for-profits, for example, value and believe differently than the for-profit organizations, and that seems pretty obvious to say that, but there are differences beyond those two distinctions as well. Getting the people in your organization to understand and buy into your organization's culture is part of your task as the leader. Culture is practically everywhere. The men's room, the ladies' room, elevators, it's everywhere. When you start recognizing it, you react differently to it. I usually go into a little talk about the culture in the bathrooms and the elevators. I'll do that real quickly. And I'm not talking about culture in the bathroom. I'm not talking about bacteria, which are clearly there. I'm talking about the actual culture of how people react in those facilities or going to them. For example, Women will get up from a table and say, I'm going to the restroom, and you want to come with me? And another lady might get up and go with her to the restroom. I have never yet seen or heard another man invite another man to go to the restroom with him. Those are just two different cultures. Men do not talk in the bathroom. I guess women do. But men don't even look at each other in the bathroom pretty much. We don't go there to talk, that's for certain. I mentioned culture in elevators. If you have never recognized that there's a culture in the elevator, you probably should watch that. It's really simple to see. People get in elevators and they turn around and they face the door. Well, there's no reason that we do that, but we do that. And if you were to get in an elevator and stand and face everyone, it would probably have a whole bunch of people uncomfortable and wondering what the heck you're doing. But if you watch, it goes up a floor or two and someone gets off, the door closes, and what do people do? They shift a little bit. They just move their body positions in the elevator, and they reestablish that personal space between each of them. And we don't know why we do that stuff. We just do it. It's some sort of customary behavior that we've adapted over time. So anyway, culture is important for you to start recognizing and understanding and see that it is different in different organizations and different places and different facilities that you're going to be working in. One of the things I also like to talk about that infects all organizations and cultures are what I call entitled employees. And when I talk about entitlement in this sense, I'm not talking about government programs like welfare. I'm talking about a more broadly defined state of entitlement where people feel they should be rewarded based on who they are rather than what they do. Typically, when I speak of this kind of employee, I see heads bobbing up and down because everyone seems to know the entitled employees in their organization and the ones I'm talking about. We know who they are, and we know that kind of person. If you don't understand what I'm talking about, consider public education's tenured school teachers. Most teachers start out as school teachers with a highly motivated reason to teach, but something happens to them along the way, and when it becomes nearly impossible to fire them for non-performance, you really start to see those problems pop up. And it's those employees who are seemingly not afraid of people because maybe they've been a CNA in your facility for 25 years, they're sometimes like a virus in your organization. These people are way over secure that their employment won't be terminated. They think the rules don't apply to them, or they've made so many rules along the way to protect themselves. They are nearly impossible to get productivity out of them for these various reasons. If you were to think of entitlement as an anxiety level where these people are very secure, have you considered what the opposite of that would be, or what the middle ground might be? The opposite anxiety level of entitlement would be one of fear, which is also non-productive. So the middle ground would be where you might rightly expect to find the most productive employees. The middle ground being where people are earning their way, and instead of no respect and fear, you actually have a proper sense of respect in that middle ground. The three anxiety levels I'm talking about are entitlement, and then there's the earning that I mentioned, and fear. And I think we need to understand how the middle ground, you find that people are still energized by the challenge, and they know that their rewards are going to be based on their work, and they accomplish rather than they accomplish things and based on who, what they want to accomplish, not expecting a reward for who they are. Certainly this affects productivity when you think about it, and I've graphed that out to kind of give you a picture of what it looks like. What I'm showing in this graph, on the one axis are these anxiety levels. Low anxiety is on the left in entitlement, and high anxiety on the right in fear. And the other axis is productivity, and you can see in this bell curve that both the entitlement and fear anxiety levels produce less than that in-between level I'm calling earning, or you could actually say that's also respect level. To help some of you to further understand some of the implications of these different levels, I've added some numbers to this graph along the path of this bell curve to explain some of the implications for you to understand more about what it means. Individuals along this bell curve would have some of the same kinds of reactions as described on that graph. The fully entitled person, for example, at number 1 would simply think, you owe me, where on the other end, the person is scared to move, essentially. They're scared to death. They don't do anything without permission or supervision. If you wanted to look through a social lens, you probably could, relevant to what's going in our government these days, but that's not the purpose of the lesson today, so come back to that on your own time if it interests you, and it might with everything that's going on. Organizations seem to fall on that line at a certain place too. They are more or less productive, and you can figure out where they are too by looking at this. Public schools, which we talked about earlier, where tenured teachers are very hard to fire, they're going to be on the lower end of productivity. Where the other end of the spectrum, you don't know what today's rules are because those people are afraid they're going to change from what they were told yesterday, so they're sort of frozen and afraid to produce too. So the point is that getting your employees into that center, higher producing, earning anxiety level has to be your goal. And just the question then is, how do you do this? How do you get your folks into this high productivity area? And importantly, how are you going to keep them there? And this is how it works. It's rather an ongoing process, actually. Simply put, it starts at what I've labeled as A here, by requiring performance. What happens when you require performance? You can see that in this graph that I've drawn here that people are going to shoot straight over to the B area, straight over across the spectrum into fear, because there's a new sheriff in town, essentially, once you started applying some pressure. Morale's going to drop just a little bit, essentially, and you'll see efforts by these people to return to that comfort zone of being entitled and not having to earn their way. It ends up being a bit of a tug of war, essentially. The takeaway from this is that you should stay the course. Continue to require performance. Your pressure for them to earn will be balanced by their efforts to return to entitlement and will ultimately settle in that earning productivity level. So stay the course and require performance. The key to getting out of entitlement is holding people accountable. Essentially, if you do that consistently, you will do well. So, at this point, I would just pause for a second and say, point out that throughout my slides, you may have noticed that I've placed some leadership quotes from various people, like this one that points out that you should never set someone up for failure, essentially. Give these people the tools they need to succeed, and that's all part of being a leader, just like teaching is also part of leading. To reinforce that, communication is often about teaching. With your management hat on, you have to establish the goals and objectives for the facility or the organization. Putting on your leadership hat, you have to communicate those goals and why they're important and how much you believe in them. And you have to communicate these things clearly. But you also have to be prepared to identify the barriers and be prepared to remove those barriers and to set your team up for success, not failure. I always sum this up that you should never be afraid to offend entitled subordinates. If you're consistent about requiring performance and reward performance for what they do rather than who they are, you will find that you will remain nestled in the most highly productive zones most of the time. Normally in a face-to-face presentation, I'd pause here to see if anyone has any questions or want to go any deeper into any of those kinds of topics about culture or entitlement. Since leadership and management is what I consider to be the domain that sets an administrator apart as a professional administrator, and that so many people think it's so easy. I like to take a little more time and go into a few more aspects of leadership to consider having in your toolkit as a leader. Again, typically at this point, in a face-to-face presentation, I offer this demonstration. I'm going to try it here. I have no idea if you'll be playing along at home in front of your computer screen or not, but typically students in the classroom do participate. So here's the demonstration. I hope you'll play along. Let's start by asking you to put down your pencils and pens, you're taking notes, and sit back in your chair and relax. You might imagine the entire classroom of yourself and your fellow classmates putting down their pencils now and settling back in their chairs. As you settle back in your chair, look up at the ceiling. Continue to relax. Now I want you to start making that gargling sound. Gargling sound, yes, that's what I said. Again, I'm accustomed to a classroom full of people doing this together, if you can imagine that. 20 or 30 people making that gargling sound. But please go ahead and make that sound. I'm typically just standing at the front of the class watching everyone. I even let a couple of people know it's okay to get a little drink of water, and if you think that's going to help you make the sound better. So, are you doing this at home in front of your computer as I continue to talk through this little demo? At this point, I say, okay, now, why are you doing that? That's the point where everyone sits up in their chair and they start to give me answers. I can only imagine that some of you did it at home and some of you didn't. Even in the classroom, there are sometimes, but not always, one or two people who don't do the exercise. I can see who they are. They're typically sitting there looking in awe at the rest of their class and wondering what kind of people are in their class. Since this is the first day of class typically, what have they gotten themselves into here is what they seem to be wondering. So I ask them the other question, why didn't you do it? The answers I get to why they did do range from, well, you're the teacher, or you're the leader, or while the ones who say they didn't, the ones who didn't do it will typically be in the range of, I didn't see the purpose in it, or since I just watched that Simon Sinek video, that made sense because I didn't tell anybody why we're doing the demonstration, to other answers like, I couldn't see what this could possibly teach me. Those are all good and valid answers. But for those who did do the exercise, my follow-up question is, what if I had asked you to do something else, something really undignified? You can fill in the blank there as to what that might be. Would you have done it? Surely each of you can think of something I could have asked you to do that you wouldn't have done, just as I can think of things that I wouldn't even consider asking you to do that could make great examples. And the light bulb comes on for you, because here's what you realize. It's called the zone of indifference, and each of us has varying levels of what we would do or not do, and as long as your subordinates stay in that zone of indifference, they generally do what you ask them to do. You may have to learn where this line is for different people and for different things, but understanding this concept is also important. If you're asking people to do something you yourself wouldn't do, there is a pretty good chance they're not going to want to do it. And all those reasons that people give me for why they did or didn't participate in the demonstration, they relate to other sources of power that a leader has that they also need to understand as they work to get the mission accomplished, leading people and doing things. This is a list of some of those sources of power. You're the instructor, that's what they said. I have no legitimate authority to ask anybody to gargle. Maybe you thought I have a network of good garglers I could hook you up with. I doubt that. I didn't threaten anyone if they didn't. I didn't promise we'd get out of class early if everyone participated. I certainly didn't tell you why I wanted you to do it. But everyone participated for their own reasons or understanding, perhaps because now they trusted that it would eventually make sense to them. And I do hope that that is the case, that you do now have a better understanding of this phenomena called the zone of indifference. But let's take a peek at each of these sources of power and talk a little bit about each one of them, try to understand them a little bit as well. Looking back at our demonstration, I really didn't lead by example or model that behavior of gargling, but I didn't really need to because everyone understands what gargling is and what that sounds like. Legitimate authority is something you will have because you're the administrator. That comes with legitimate authority to tell people to do things. But did you ever like to hear, "because I said so," as the answer your parents gave? You will build that legitimate authority by walking the walk. Leading by example is a powerful, powerful tool. The organization gives you that legitimate authority, but you need to build on it. You are the leader by position. You're not the leader if you're not leading. One of the stories I think back on was during my time as a commander of a basic training squadron, a boot camp. When I first took command of that organization, one of the drill sergeants took me on a tour of the grounds and facilities. Big facility, great place. As we were walking around, I found myself walking off of the sidewalk at one point, and I picked up a piece of trash. The drill sergeant informed me that I shouldn't do that because they didn't want the trainees to see their commander picking up trash. I let him know that if I see trash, I'm going to pick it up. And his response was a simple, "Drill sergeant, yes sir." I found out later that these drill sergeants were so serious about protecting my image from the trainees that they had actually discussed this at a meeting and determined that anytime they saw me outside the building, someone needed to go with me and watch in front of me to pick up trash and keep me from doing so. I had a pretty immaculate place after that, by the way. Drill sergeants, which are called MTIs, military training instructors, are a special breed for sure. I had to learn to work with them too. You really have to watch what you, as the leader, say to people, as I showed you in that demonstration. Drill sergeants, for example, if I happened to say, "I wonder what that door would look like if it was green," would paint the door green, interpreting my wondering as a directive to paint the door green. You're going to run into people like that too, willing to do what you say, whether you meant it or not. And you need to deal with that and be ready for it. Expert power is an interesting source. When you're the administrator, people do and will look up to you. They think you're the fountain of all long-term care knowledge. And when you think about it, you have to have a great deal of knowledge about a lot of things in this field. Everyone else is specialized. You can see a nurse, for example, working in a clinical setting or in a hospital or in assisted living or nursing home or just about anywhere in a healthcare field. CNAs also found in other settings, just like pharmacists, attorneys, HR specialists, business office people. Most of these professionals and professions and trades can find work with their skills outside of long-term care. A long-term care administrator, they can only use that license in a long-term care setting. So they are the hub of how all these parts work together. So you do have to know a lot. The worst thing you can do to that reputation is to be wrong. If you don't know something when someone asks you about something, you can't try to fake it and shoot from the hip with your answer. If you don't know, tell them it's a good question and you'll look it up and get back with them. Then don't fail to look it up and then give them the right answer. This goes not only for your team, but it extends to your peers in terms of networking, as there's a relationship to expert knowledge there as well. Networks and alliances are pretty powerful. You get to know your friends and know who knows things. This thing they call the norm of reciprocity requires that we repay in kind what another has done for us. It can be understood as the expectation that people will respond favorably to each other by returning benefits for benefits and responding with either indifference or hostility to harms. idiosyncratic credit is a concept in social psychology that describes an individual's capacity to acceptably deviate from group expectations. They are increased or earned each time an individual conforms to a group's expectations, and decreased or spent each time an individual deviates from the group's expectations. Leaders with many credits are often afforded a greater ability to try innovative strategies to meet group goals. If your ideas prove to work, they're going to go along with you. If your track record isn't so good, they're going to be hesitant. But this network thing, just knowing people, is important. An example of that is a guy named Bernard Baruch did a big favor for a man named J.P. Morgan, and J.P. Morgan said, thank you very much. What can I do to repay you for that? And Bernard Baruch kind of thought about it for a little bit and said, I'd just like to give you a tour of my factory, if that's okay with you. And he's like, I could pay you a lot of money for what you just did, all those kinds of things. And you just want me to take a tour of your factory? And he said, yes, sir, that's what I want. And so they scheduled it, and he came down and gave him a tour. And everybody knows who J.P. Morgan was. And, as he walks him into the building, all these employees are seeing Mr. Baruch walk through the building with J.P. Morgan, and they're pretty impressed. So he's just earned himself a bunch of credit with all these people to think that, he knows him, and that they're peers and they work together, and all of a sudden his credibility went through the roof. And when he came up with ideas, people went along with him, and that was worth quite a bit of money for that man running that factory to do that sort of thing. So, maybe if you know your owner, get him to come along with you sometime through the building, let everybody see that they know who he is. Another source of power is this use of coercive power. I really don't recommend it. It has no lasting impact. It's for short-term use only. You do have a lot of authority as the administrator, and you can use this, but I would say use it sparingly. And at the same time, I would say don't be afraid to use it. But if you say you're going to do it credibility-wise, don't threaten it and then don't follow through. If you're going to say it, do it. The piece that goes along with that is reward power. It's very similar, but it's the opposite. It's, on the other hand, you probably can't thank people enough for what they do. You need to go out of your way to make sure you say something positive and in front of their peers. That goes a really long way. Your recognition of them doing a good job sometimes goes further than any bonus you might be able to offer them. People do have a need to be recognized for their good work, and you should never fail to feed that need. Likability may be that charisma that we alluded to earlier. It may be a summation of your character, and that we're talking about when we talk about charisma and likability. When you're a genuinely good person, it actually comes through. You really can't fake it, and you shouldn't try. For example, if you have a housekeeper that takes a day off work because they have a sick son, and comes back the next day, and you see them in the hallway, and they say, "Hey, how's Johnny doing today?" That might go a long way to show that you're not only aware of their situation, and that you miss them, and you're staying in tune with them, unless their son's name isn't Johnny. But it will go a long way to make them feel better all around. I've highlighted the word empowerment up here because a few years back this was one of the management buzzwords that nobody really understood. I usually ask the class if anybody can explain empowerment, and people take a stab at it, but nobody really seems to understand it yet. Years ago, when I was on the Inspector General's IG team, we would do inspections, sort of like surveys, but we would deploy an entire base to a base that had closed in another part of the United States, and pretend that they were going overseas, just to see how they performed in getting themselves deployed into new places, and how they protected themselves, how they communicated, all those kinds of things. We wanted to see that they had all those kinds of things in place. We put them through numerous exercises, and one of those exercises that we put them through was what we called a sniper attack. Now, let me explain. We don't really shoot at people in these exercises. We use what was called Miles gear, which is really nothing more than laser tag, where everybody had little receptors on their clothing that if a laser touched it, it would beep and light up. And if you were beeping or lighting, then you laid down because you'd been shot. That's basically how that worked. So when I talk about shooting people, I'm not really talking about shooting people, but the activating of the laser was done with a blank round, so you could hear the gun being shot. It was a blank shooting, and so people could hear when you're shooting. And we were doing it was a terrible, terrible sniper attack. Most sniper attacks are done from like a mile away, and you can't see or hear that you've been shot at. You just notice that the guy next to you just fell down and he's bleeding, and you don't know why he fell down, and until it dawns on you that, hey, someone's shooting at us. Hopefully that wasn't you that got the shot, but at any rate, we were doing a bad sniper attack when there were 3 of us with guns, and sniper attacks are usually just one person and another person spotting for them with the binoculars, but 3 of us, and we took up a position literally across the street from through the chain link fence at the gate from behind a dumpster. We started shooting at these guys and watched them scramble like cockroaches on the other side of the fence. And we could hear them talking to each other, and then literally I heard a guy say, "I see them, they're behind the dumpster." And as he's speaking, my head goes on a swivel, and it's like radar, and I zoom in, and there's the guy talking, and I could see him. He's on the radio. He's sitting in a machine gun nest where he could have wiped us out in a second once he saw us and do that. But he says, "I see them. They're behind the dumpster. Request permission to return fire." And by the time he finished saying return fire, he was beeping, and his light was going off, and he was no longer able to return fire because he was theoretically shot already. The point that I'm trying to make there with that story is that empowerment, if that guy had been empowered, he could have ended that exercise really quickly by being empowered. When you're shot at, you shoot back. Everybody knows that, right? They should. And that's basically what empowerment is knowing that when you're shot at, you shoot back. So when you've got something going on in your facility, people don't have to stop what they're doing, call you, and get your read on it before they react. Hey, the Mrs. Smith down the hall is having a heart attack. Should we do CPR? Let's call the administrator. That's not what empowerment is. People need to understand the mission. They need to understand and do the right things. If you run out of toilet paper on a Saturday morning, do they need to call you and say, "Hey, we're out of toilet paper. Can you do something for us?" Or do they just take the petty cash and go down the street to Walmart and get some toilet paper and fix the problem and let you know that there was a problem so that you can take care of it with the guy that should have ordered it, should have had it set up before the weekend. So anyway, that's it. When you're being shot at, shoot back. People don't understand what empowerment is, and the other problem with empowerment is that when people don't understand the mission and they mess up, a lot of people come in and they start yelling at them for doing the wrong thing. Well, you just push them into the fear side. Remember that side? You need to take that time to understand why they made the choice they did. You should be glad that they did take that initiative to do something, but you need to re-educate them perhaps and let them know what the mission is and what the right response should have been and why. Why is still big. If they continue to mess up, maybe it's time to let them go. Because either they don't agree with your vision of what the mission is about, or they just don't get it and they maybe never will. So anyway, if you're being shot at, shoot back. Principled arguments. I'm not going to beat this dead horse. You heard the TED talk on Start With Why. I think you'll get that one by now. It is very, very important if you can take the time. It does take more time to explain why, but sometimes it's very, very worth the time. People respond differently to these different tools. Coercive power, you do have all these tools at your disposal, but you need to understand that people are going to resist coercive power. They don't like to be threatened. They will comply because you said so, since you are the administrator, and they will come along if you give them a carrot now and then, just normal compliance. They'll comply with what you're doing. But when you want them to internalize their understanding, you're going to have to take that time, use some of your expert power, explain things, principled argument, tell them why, and speak to them about these things. And those things are going to stay with them the longest, and they'll internalize those and respond appropriately almost all the time when they have internalized those lessons. That's pretty much all I'm going to go into for leadership and management today. Surely you can see that this is an important area for an administrator to master. As you become an administrator, you're going to learn that people are really, really exciting, and they're going to be surprising you almost every day with something you could have never thought of. I continue to be amazed with people. At this point, I'm just going to pause. This is where I would take questions and discussions. And if you watched this prior to our meeting on Thursday or Friday, if you have questions, make sure you ask me on Thursday or Friday when you're actually in the class. But I hope you enjoyed this and hope you got something out of it. Thank you.